In this episode, we are taking a step beyond simply finding vulnerabilities and into the harder but much more useful work of understanding what those vulnerabilities actually mean in the environment where they exist. Context-aware vulnerability analysis is the practice of looking at a weakness together with the surrounding facts that shape its real importance, such as what system is affected, who can reach it, what data it touches, what business function it supports, and what protections already exist around it. A vulnerability on paper can look severe, moderate, or even minor, but that label alone rarely tells the whole story a defender needs in order to make a good decision. For a beginner, the easiest way to understand this idea is to imagine two houses with the same broken lock, where one protects an empty shed and the other protects a pharmacy storing controlled medicine. The lock problem is technically similar in both places, but the risk is not, because the surrounding circumstances change the meaning of the weakness. Context-aware analysis is what helps defenders make that distinction instead of treating every flaw as if it lives in the same world. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A vulnerability report by itself is usually a starting point rather than a finished answer. It tells you that a weakness may be present, and sometimes it gives useful technical detail about severity, exploitability, or affected software, but it does not automatically explain how that weakness fits into the environment you are responsible for defending. Context-aware analysis begins when the analyst asks what the affected asset actually does, what would happen if it were compromised, and whether the conditions around it make the flaw easy to abuse or difficult to reach. This matters because organizations do not defend abstract vulnerabilities in the laboratory. They defend real systems that support real work, store real information, and connect to other systems in ways that can either increase or reduce the practical danger of a finding. A scanner may say that a certain server has a serious flaw, but the analyst still has to determine whether that server is internet-facing, whether it holds sensitive data, whether it is isolated, and whether it is critical to operations. That shift from raw finding to real-world meaning is the heart of context-aware analysis, and it is one of the most important habits an effective vulnerability analyst can build. One of the first layers of context is the purpose of the asset itself. A flaw on a domain controller, identity platform, payment server, medical application, or industrial control interface usually deserves different attention than the same flaw on a low-value test system with no sensitive data and little connectivity. The reason is simple. The system's role shapes the consequence of compromise. A weakness on a system that controls authentication or stores regulated customer information may create immediate organizational danger, while the same weakness on an isolated practice environment may carry much lower urgency, even though the technical description is identical. This does not mean low-value systems are irrelevant, because attackers can still use them as stepping stones. But it does mean analysts must understand what the asset contributes to the business before deciding how serious the finding is in practice. Beginners sometimes focus too heavily on the vulnerability and too little on the target, yet the target often tells you more about likely impact than the vulnerability label alone. Context-aware analysis therefore begins by asking not only what is wrong, but also where it is wrong and why that system matters. Exposure is another major part of context, because a weakness that is easy to reach usually deserves more immediate attention than one that exists behind multiple layers of restriction. If a vulnerable service is available to the public internet, reachable from broad internal networks, or exposed through a widely used application, the chances of misuse are usually higher than if the same service is accessible only from a tightly controlled administrative segment. Reachability changes the attacker's options, and that makes it a critical part of the analysis. An issue that looks severe on paper may become even more urgent when it is visible from the outside, because an external attacker does not need prior foothold or special positioning to begin probing it. By contrast, a technically similar issue buried deep inside a segmented network may still matter greatly, but the path to exploitation is narrower and often depends on additional failures or prior compromise. Good analysts learn to think in terms of who can get to the weakness, from where, and under what conditions. That kind of thinking transforms a vulnerability from a simple technical problem into a realistic scenario about opportunity and access. User and privilege context also matter because the same flaw can behave very differently depending on what kind of account or role is required to take advantage of it. A vulnerability that can be triggered by any unauthenticated user from a common interface is usually more alarming than one that requires administrator access on the local machine, because the barrier to entry is much lower. At the same time, analysts must be careful not to dismiss internally gated issues too quickly, because modern attacks often involve stolen credentials, privilege escalation, and lateral movement after an initial foothold has already been gained. Context-aware analysis asks whether the attacker would need to be anonymous, authenticated, local, or highly privileged, and whether those conditions are realistic in the environment being assessed. It also asks what kind of authority the vulnerable component itself possesses, because a weakness inside a high-privileged service may create more serious downstream effects than the same flaw inside a limited user process. This helps the analyst understand both sides of privilege: the privilege required to trigger the weakness and the privilege gained or abused if the weakness is exploited successfully. That distinction is subtle, but it is extremely important in making sound vulnerability decisions. Data context is equally important because many security decisions are really decisions about protecting information rather than merely protecting machines. A system that contains customer records, financial transactions, health data, intellectual property, legal documents, or administrative secrets often deserves higher attention when a vulnerability appears, even if the flaw itself is not the most dramatic one in the report. A moderately severe issue on a database holding sensitive information may represent greater organizational risk than a higher-rated issue on a system that processes no important data at all. Context-aware analysis therefore asks what data the asset stores, processes, transmits, or can reach through trusted connections. It also considers whether that data is regulated, confidential, strategically valuable, or linked to safety or public trust. For beginners, this is a helpful reminder that the purpose of vulnerability management is not simply to reduce the number of weaknesses in a chart. The purpose is to reduce the chance that weakness leads to harmful outcomes, and harmful outcomes are often defined by the loss, exposure, alteration, or misuse of data that the business or its customers depend on. Control context changes the picture as well, because a vulnerability rarely exists in a completely undefended space. Firewalls, segmentation, access control, logging, endpoint protection, monitoring, application safeguards, and other measures can reduce how reachable a weakness is or how much damage it can cause if exploited. This does not erase the underlying issue, and good analysts should be careful not to treat compensating controls as a permanent excuse for leaving problems unresolved. Even so, those protections matter because they affect practical exploitability and response urgency. A high-severity flaw on a system with strong segmentation, aggressive monitoring, and tightly limited access may still need attention, but the timeline and response plan may differ from a similar flaw on a broadly reachable system with poor visibility and weak controls. Context-aware analysis, therefore, means looking at the weakness and the protective environment together. That balanced view helps the organization avoid both overreaction and underreaction, because it recognizes that the real risk comes from the interaction between the weakness and the defenses that surround it, not from the flaw in isolation. Timing is another powerful form of context, and it is often overlooked by people who are new to vulnerability work. A vulnerability that has existed quietly for years without practical exploitation may still be serious, but the urgency can change dramatically if credible exploit code becomes widely available, active attacks begin targeting it, or public attention increases the likelihood of rapid abuse. In other words, the same technical flaw can become more dangerous simply because the surrounding threat environment changes. Context-aware analysis pays attention to whether attackers are actually using the weakness, whether it is part of current campaigns, and whether the organization's exposure makes it a realistic target right now. This is important because defenders do not work in frozen time. They operate in an environment where threats evolve, attacker interest shifts, and once obscure weaknesses can become urgent very quickly. A mature analyst, therefore, does not ask only how bad the flaw is in theory. The analyst also asks whether this is the kind of flaw attackers are focusing on now, and whether the organization is positioned in a way that makes it especially relevant. Operational context matters too, because the right response to a vulnerability depends not only on technical severity, but also on what remediation will require from the business. A weakness on a critical production system may deserve urgent action, yet the fix might involve downtime, vendor coordination, compatibility testing, or maintenance windows that cannot happen immediately without affecting customers or operations. Context-aware analysis helps analysts recommend action that is both security-conscious and operationally realistic. That does not mean the organization should accept dangerous delays casually, but it does mean the analyst must understand the trade-offs involved in patching, configuration change, service restart, or architectural modification. In some cases, a temporary mitigation may be the safest immediate choice while a more complete fix is prepared. In other cases, delay may be unacceptable because the weakness is too exposed or too consequential. Beginners often imagine vulnerability remediation as a simple yes or no decision. Yet real organizations need analysts who can balance urgency with stability, because security decisions are most useful when they can actually be carried out in the environment that exists today. Another crucial part of context-aware analysis is understanding relationships between assets rather than looking at each finding in isolation. A flaw on a single machine may not look especially serious until you realize that the machine sits between a user network and a sensitive application zone, or that it holds trusted credentials, or that it can reach many other systems through shared administration pathways. Attackers often succeed not because one vulnerability is catastrophic by itself, but because one weakness opens the door to the next step in a larger sequence. This is why analysts need to think about attack paths, trust boundaries, and lateral movement instead of treating every affected asset as its own little island. A medium-severity weakness on a jump host, management server, or identity-linked asset may have outsized importance because of what it connects to. Context-aware analysis therefore asks what other systems depend on the asset, what systems it can influence, and whether compromise there would create a bridge to more valuable targets. That broader view makes vulnerability analysis much more realistic, because real attacks move through environments, not just into one machine and then stop. Context-aware analysis also helps explain why two organizations can see the same vulnerability and make different but equally reasonable decisions. One company may treat the issue as an immediate emergency because the affected asset is public-facing, central to revenue, and connected to sensitive data. Another may place it into a planned remediation cycle because the asset is isolated, low value, and buffered by several effective controls. This does not mean the vulnerability is being interpreted inconsistently in some careless way. It means the surrounding context is different, so the risk judgment is different. That is one reason security professionals should be cautious about speaking as though a vulnerability always demands exactly one response everywhere. The technical severity may be stable, but the meaning of that severity depends on the environment in which it appears. For beginners, this is an important lesson because it shows that context-aware analysis is not about making excuses or softening security. It is about making decisions that reflect the real world instead of pretending all assets, exposures, and consequences are the same. A common mistake among inexperienced analysts is to confuse scoring with priority. A common vulnerability scoring system, CVSS, number or a vendor severity label is useful because it describes technical seriousness in a standardized way, but it does not automatically answer the business question of what should be addressed first. Context-aware analysis is what bridges that gap. It takes technical severity and adds exposure, asset value, privilege conditions, data sensitivity, control strength, threat activity, and operational consequence so the team can prioritize intelligently. Without that added context, organizations often waste effort chasing high-scoring issues on low-value assets while slower-moving but strategically important risks remain unresolved. The point is not that scoring is wrong. The point is that scores need context in order to become useful decisions. When new analysts understand this, they stop reading vulnerability reports like sorted shopping lists and start reading them like problem sets that require thoughtful interpretation before action. Communication improves dramatically when analysts use context well. A system owner is much more likely to act on a finding when the explanation goes beyond saying that the tool rated it critical and instead explains that the issue affects a public-facing service tied to customer accounts, that exploit activity is increasing, that the server can reach sensitive internal systems, and that monitoring is limited in that segment. That kind of explanation is persuasive because it connects the technical problem to the business and operational reality the owner actually cares about. Context-aware analysis, therefore, makes remediation conversations more credible, more specific, and more useful than generic vulnerability reporting ever could. It also helps leadership understand why some lower-scoring findings demand immediate attention, while some higher-scoring findings can be addressed through staged action. For beginners, this is a vital professional skill because much of security work depends on convincing other people to take the right actions. Context is often what makes the difference between a report that gets ignored and a finding that gets resolved. There is also a strategic benefit to context-aware analysis because it helps organizations improve the systems and processes that keep generating risk. When analysts look at vulnerabilities in context, they begin to see patterns. Certain business units may repeatedly expose services too broadly. Certain asset types may consistently lack monitoring. Certain administrative pathways may create recurring high-value attack paths, or certain cloud deployments may keep producing the same permission problems. Those patterns tell the organization that the problem is not only the individual vulnerability. The problem may also be a weak deployment model, poor segmentation, inconsistent hardening, or unclear ownership. Context-aware analysis is therefore not only about better triage in the moment. It is also about learning what the environment keeps getting wrong so the business can reduce whole categories of risk instead of merely fixing one ticket at a time. That deeper learning makes the vulnerability program more mature over time because the organization begins to address root causes rather than endlessly processing symptoms. The most important mindset shift in this topic is learning that a vulnerability is never just a technical fact. It is a technical fact living inside a business, a network, a set of identities, a data environment, a threat landscape, and an operational reality. Context-aware vulnerability analysis brings all of those surrounding facts into view so that defenders can decide not only whether a weakness exists, but whether it is reachable, meaningful, urgent, and capable of causing serious harm in the place where it was found. That is what separates a basic list of findings from a real defensive assessment. When you understand the context, you understand what the vulnerability is likely to mean to your organization instead of relying on generic assumptions from a scanner or vendor report. This makes decisions better, communication clearer, and remediation more focused on real risk rather than abstract fear. It also helps analysts grow into trusted advisors because they are no longer just repeating what the tool said. They are interpreting what the tool found in a way that supports sound judgment. The big takeaway is that context-aware vulnerability analysis turns vulnerability management from a counting exercise into a decision-making discipline. It asks defenders to look beyond the flaw itself and consider the role of the asset, the exposure path, the privilege requirements, the data involved, the controls in place, the current threat environment, the operational realities of remediation, and the relationships between systems that could amplify the danger. Those surrounding facts are what transform a technical weakness into a real organizational risk, and without them, prioritization is often shallow and misleading. Once you understand how context works, you can see why the same vulnerability may deserve a completely different response depending on where it appears and what surrounds it. That perspective is essential for any CySA Plus learner, because good analysts are not defined only by their ability to detect weakness. They are defined by their ability to understand what that weakness means in the real environment they are tasked with defending and to help the organization act accordingly.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.